All right, so as usual, the questions continue to be very good. Is the use of cognitive dissonance for persuasion a long-term solution to the issue being persuaded? For example, in the children asking for lighter example, would they be more likely to quit smoking long-term, or is it only a short-term solution? I went looking, and there have been a few experiments done over the years to demonstrate how long the effect of attitude change from cognitive dissonance continues. One study published in 1965, so a while ago, what happened was children were put in the same room as a very, very desirable toy. Half of the children, all the children were told, you're not to play with it. Half of them were told, if you play with the toy, I will be very angry and frown at you. The other half were told, if you play with the toy, you will break the law and we will lock you up in jail. So what they made was a high punishment and low punishment condition. Frowning, low punishment. Lock up in jail, high punishment. They then left the room, left the child with the toy. All the children who played with the toy, they kept track, and about a month later, they brought the children back. They put the toy in the room with them without saying anything. Didn't say, don't play with it. Didn't say they would be punished. The children who chose to play with the toy previously in the high punishment condition, threatened with jail, they were a lot more likely to play with it the second time. The ones who had only been threatened with, I will be angry and frown at you, some of them did, some of them didn't. And the fact that the cognitive dissonance effect lasted even after a month, they reported that as the difference in attitude is not just for that day or that week. If a month has gone by and the attitude change toward that toy still exists, then likely changes to attitudes brought about by cognitive dissonance, they last. Now that does not squarely answer this question, because this question is asking about behavior change. The example I gave was of someone smoking who told a small child, you shouldn't smoke and no, you can't borrow my lighter. So they're asking, that moment where you feel guilty because the child points out, if it's unhealthy for me, it's also unhealthy for you. Is that momentary attitude change? Or would that change behavior over the long term? My answer to that, I'm going to recommend another book. That one, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. He won the Nobel Prize in Economics. A couple of you in your paragraphs, you mentioned things like availability heuristic, confirmation bias. He's the pioneer behind all of those. But in this book, what he talks about, he explains the difference between what we imagine when we hear the word thinking. We imagine that thinking, you concentrate, you pay careful attention to every detail, and that it's almost like working a math problem. It's very step by step and attentive. And he calls that System 2. But most of the thinking we do, and this is broadly accepted in the social sciences, most of it we do automatically. We don't pay attention. We don't collect information. We don't come up with reasons. We just make snap judgments. Now, our brain is doing it, but our brain is not being careful and it's not working through a process. So how does that answer the question about cognitive dissonance and behavior change? Well, this idea, System 1, System 2, has been applied to how persuasion works. A couple of researchers named Richard Petty and John Cacioppo, they said if you want to understand persuasion, you have to look at the person you're trying to persuade. When you give them your message, are they going to process it through System 1 or System 2? If they hear your persuasive message and just make a snap judgment, then what you should do to persuade them, give them something that makes it very easy to make a decision. Something where they don't have to concentrate, where they don't have to work through a process. And actually, last week, when we talked about the heuristics, that is what you use to persuade people if they're going to process it through System 1. Now, System 2, if they're going to think very carefully, like you would do when you work a math problem, then what you should do is give them the best evidence you've got supporting the best argument you've got. If I said, hey, let's go grab a snack from the convenience store, I don't think you would stand there all day looking at the nutritional value of the snacks. You would grab one. That's a snap decision you'd make with System 1. But if you had a serious health problem and the doctor said you should have major surgery, I bet you would think about that decision using System 2. You would think very carefully. You would want it explained. You would want to know, are there likely to be complications from the surgery? I'm getting closer to an answer because this question asked, what produces long-term behavior change? And the research is clear. If you can get someone to process your persuasive message through System 2, and you make a good, evidenced argument that they accept, then they will change their behavior and it stays changed. There are two situations in which I commonly do this with my students in the United States. I have about a 10-minute talk I give about how your music that you are playing through your phone and your earbuds is destroying your hearing and you're not noticing it. I give it in almost every class I teach. And I have had students come back 20 years later and tell me they still keep their music turned down because of the talk I had with them. I make one argument, give them the best evidence I can. I try to raise their motivation so they'll use System 2, not System 1. And that, the research says, is what brings about long-lasting behavior change. Now, can you do that with cognitive dissonance? To finally answer the question, cognitive dissonance is the tool in the toolbox when you have a stubborn target who's going to experience psychological reactance. When you have someone whose reaction to your persuasive appeal will be, don't tell me what to do. Because with cognitive dissonance, you don't tell them what to do. You just give them an uncomfortable thought, and they decide what to do. Long question, or long answer, but you voted that question most popular, and it's a complicated one. All right. When does persuasion turn into manipulation? Where is the line? Excellent question. When I teach my persuasion class, we have one day at the beginning of the semester about ethics. We have a 5-part test of ethics. It is the work of Sherry Baker and Don Martinson from Brigham Young University. That's the 5-part test of ethical persuasion. Now, the question was about manipulation. These two elements, respect and equity, they answer the question. The requirement of respect, if you want to treat someone ethically while you are persuading them, you refrain from violating their rights. You treat them as worthy of dignity. You honor their choices. So as you are trying to persuade them, if they've made it clear that they've chosen, they've made their choice, and you continue to pester or pressure them, then you're not showing respect. If you try to override their choice when they've made it, then what you're doing is no longer persuasion. Persuasion is an attempt to influence or guide choice. You can force people, you can coerce people, that is no longer persuasion. As far as equity, the exact wording Baker and Martinson use for the equity test is don't overpower and don't manipulate. Don't overpower or manipulate. And one sort of bit of elaboration is they say follow the golden rule. Treat them the way you would want to be treated if the situation was reversed. Now, for both of those tests, they provide questions to ask yourself. For the respect question, this is the way they phrased it. Does this comply with what my religion teaches about loving kindness? And the other question under respect, they say, will the recipient of the persuasive appeal benefit from this message? As I persuade them, is it going to help them? Or am I persuading them just to help me? The questions with the equity requirements. Am I letting the recipient of the message think it over and argue back? If so, I'm being equitable. If I'm not allowing it, I probably am not. Did I target a vulnerable audience and make claims they don't understand? And am I being clear? My purpose is persuading, not just informing. If you can answer all those questions the right way, you're being equitable. So that, I would say, is where the line is between persuasion and manipulation. The third question today made me laugh my head off. How does cognitive dissonance theory explain the relationship between individuals' beliefs, attitudes, and behavior, and what are the potential implications for decision-making, persuasion, and attitude change? We had a joke when I was in graduate school. Summarize the universe, give 3 examples. That's what this is. If I had a whole year where all your college classes were just with me, we wouldn't get through this question. So, I am going to try. I am going to give you some of the highlights. I think this is probably the last question I have time for. You voted this question up as interesting, so we are going to get as far as we can. Cognitive dissonance was first proposed by Leon Festinger as a challenge to learning theory. Learning theory tried to explain, as people encounter new information, how do they then go and use that new information? And Festinger thought, you're missing something obvious. Because learning theory, it made it sound as though every time you learned something, it was like bringing your groceries home from the store and just putting them in the refrigerator. Your new knowledge went into your head and it waited until you needed it. And Festinger said that's not what we do with new information. It's more like putting a wild animal into a cage where there's already another wild animal. Now, it depends on what the 2 wild animals are. If one of them is a sloth and the other one is a guinea pig, they'll probably take a little nap together. They'll exist very comfortably. So sometimes you learn new information, it fits with the information you already have, no problem. But maybe in the cage, there's a pit bull, and you're about to put in a wolverine. And an hour later, there will be nothing but blood and meat and hair and bones. And sometimes we learn new information, and it's not consistent with what we already thought. And our new knowledge and our old knowledge fight one another very fiercely. The basic idea behind cognitive dissonance is being introduced to new information does not have predictable effects in the mind of the person receiving them. The consistency between what they've just learned and what they thought before can lead them off in some very unexpected directions. It can change their attitudes and their behaviors in ways you might not expect. To understand how it works as a persuasive model, you have to understand, okay, we said before, dissonance is uncomfortable. People try to reduce dissonance. And there are documented in the research at least 5 different ways to do that. And I am going to give you the quick version of those 5. There are more, but they're obscure. The main one, change the attitude. If there's an inconsistency between your attitude and your behavior, then you could change the attitude. One of the most widely studied examples of this is post-decision dissonance. Post-decision dissonance. Almost every time you make a major decision, and you no longer have the decision before you, but it's made, people experience dissonance. We sometimes call it buyer's remorse. Maybe you've saved up your money to buy a new phone, and you have 3 possible phones. You buy one of them, the money is spent. Instantly, the other 2 look better. Oh, I should have gotten that other one. It's the reason so many people start at a college and after 1 semester want to transfer. Decisions we make, the options we didn't pick, they looked attractive to us. We wanted them and we rejected them, and that produces cognitive dissonance. So, we reduce that dissonance by changing the attitude in what we call alternative spreading. Alternative spreading. You measure this in an experiment by giving people two options to choose from that are almost identical. I might come to you with a scoop of chocolate ice cream on a cone or in a cup and say, which one do you want? And after you make your choice, ask you, why was your choice better? And you're likely to give very detailed reasons why your choice was better. And if I do the experiment properly, I ask you ahead of time, do you have a preference between an ice cream cone or an ice cream cup? And when you're asked before you make the decision, commonly people say, no, it doesn't make much of a difference. But after they've chosen, all of a sudden the one they've chosen, they'll give hundreds of reasons it's better. Because you relieve the dissonance, the one I didn't choose, I'm going to make it sound bad. Cones are messy. The scoop could fall off. A cup is going to protect the ice cream. Or cones are edible. A cup is cardboard. I want something with sugar in it. I want to keep eating my dessert. People create those reasons after they make the decision to change the attitude and reduce dissonance. Second, you could change the behavior. I'll give you the other example of how I use cognitive dissonance with my students. I teach a college survival class to newly arrived first years. One thing I want them to do, I want them while they are in college to get enough sleep. I say to a room full of people, many of whom are fighting off sleep right now. Here's what I tell them, and this is true. The research shows sleep deprivation is powerfully correlated with relational termination. When you haven't had enough sleep, that person you're dating, maybe your first serious girlfriend or boyfriend, that best friend you came to college to find, they will be doing that one thing that's annoying, and you know how short-tempered you get when you haven't had enough sleep. You will say something hurtful to them that you can't ever take back. And that relationship is gone. And if you would just get enough sleep, you would be able to control yourself and you would still have that friend or girlfriend. And that's not an old, grumpy old man giving advice. The data show that consistently happens to people who have not had enough sleep. So, they want to think of themselves as popular people with lots of friends because they're newly arrived in college and that's the most important thing. They're friends. And they're staying up late because that's what cool kids do. But sleepy college students lose their friends. And I have had a number of them tell me that motivated them to at least limit how often they stayed up late. So, they may reduce their dissonance by changing the behavior. 3 other things. Sometimes they will trivialize the whole thing. They will reduce dissonance by saying the whole thing is silly and doesn't matter. So, if I were to try to use cognitive dissonance to get you to quit smoking, you like to think of yourself as a healthy person. Smoking will give you lung cancer or emphysema. You might say, who wants to get so uptight about being healthy? Who's going to live forever? I mean, everyone I know who's a health nut is a complete pain. I'm not perfect at being healthy. Kill me, okay? That's trivializing it. It doesn't matter. Cognitive dissonance is typically only enough to change behavior if you do believe that the behavior and the attitude are both important. So people relieve dissonance by telling themselves it's not. 4th, self-affirmation. Self-affirmation. We said briefly last week, cognitive dissonance is at its strongest when it undermines who you think you are. As a matter of fact, that was one of the biggest differences in how it operates between Americans and Japanese people. Americans have a sense, my strengths, my accomplishments, that's who I am. And if that was undermined, that produced strong cognitive dissonance. Japanese participants in Kitayama's studies, their self came from, this is my group, this is my role within the group, these are the people who accept me. And Kitayama found that if the cognitive dissonance message was, this creates problems for people in your group, they would not approve, they would not respect you. For Japanese participants, that created dissonance, not for Americans. And the last one, denying responsibility, which is kind of close to trivializing it. If you say, I have no choice. I know my attitudes and my behaviors are not consistent, but it's out of my control. Smokers will sometimes say, I've tried to quit. I've tried to quit dozens of times, but I'm addicted. I would quit if I could, but it's out of my control. And their dissonance goes away. They know their behavior is not consistent with their attitude, but they think they can't change it. Final thing to say. We reduce dissonance a lot of different ways, and the critiques of the research into cognitive dissonance say too many of the studies showing that cognitive dissonance is a persuasive strategy, they give only one way to reduce the dissonance. They will artificially create a situation where someone experiences dissonance and then give them an easy way to get out of it, and then publish their results. And most of those studies do not include the possibility that some people are going to reduce dissonance a different way. All the warnings on cigarette packages that say smoking is unhealthy, smokers just stop looking at those. We call that selective exposure. Sometimes the people who give you the message that creates cognitive dissonance, you just ignore them. Teenagers do it to their parents all the time. I read last week that in Canada, they are planning to put the warning about how unhealthy cigarettes are on every cigarette. It's not going to change anything. People will ignore them. All right. That's the best I can do in giving you the overview of everything there is to say from the communication perspective about cognitive dissonance. I do actually have a minute or two left. How does cognitive dissonance affect the development of a child? And what are the future outcomes of having cognitive dissonance? Cognitive dissonance is inevitable. Cognitive dissonance is a mental state when you had one belief about particular information, like whether you're in the right room. You had one belief about particular information and you find out new information that's not consistent. It happens to all of us a lot. When you're in physical pain, you do something to stop it. When a child touches a hot stove, what do they learn? Don't touch hot stoves. Sometimes children have health conditions where they have chronic pain. That may mean they are less physically active. They may not run and play as much. It may hurt their ability to make friendships. They may wind up with depression. If children are in an environment, sometimes the family life that they've got, where everything they come to believe is constantly undermined and they experience dissonance all the time, then that may be at the root of some mental health struggles. I did, for a few minutes, go digging into research to see, has anyone collected data on what happens to children when they experience dissonance a lot or all of the time? Nobody has. But that's predictably what it would be. If you never feel that you have any stable understanding of the world, I imagine you would wind up fairly messed up. All right. Why do Japanese people like to stay with groups? Because this is something I genuinely think is universal. It's not a weird phenomenon. We are drawn toward what gives us an identity. When we have an understanding that is enough of an understanding that we can make it through the day, that we can do basic things in our life, that basic understanding is what we don't want to question. So in the West, your identity, who you are, a point we've made a bunch of times, is your talents, your gifts, your accomplishments, things contained in you. But what Japanese participants in research into self-concept say again and again is, my identity is where I belong, the people who include me. So why do they stay in groups? Because that's where their identity is. People do not willingly attack their own identity, far as I know, at all. And if people's identity, as they understand it, is undermined, they'll struggle a lot to try to get it back. All right. Do I have time for what I think is the last one? I think so. What are the specific things that make faith and heuristic different? That's a little bit like saying what makes a shirt different from clothing, or what makes a dog different from an animal. A shirt is clothing. There are just other kinds of clothing that aren't shirts. A dog is an animal. There are just other kinds of animals that aren't dogs. My explanation last week is faith is a heuristic. There are just other heuristics that are not faith. Christianity teaches we have eyes and ears and brains because God created them. But there are situations where our senses and our thinking get overwhelmed and information is not helpful. Christians will use their faith in God as a familiar path to make sense of things when information is overwhelming and not helpful. The same way people will sometimes use tradition or following other people or the other heuristics we talked about last week. All right, I have overshot by 1 minute. Last week, I said we had run out of ways that I could put you in new trios, so we were going all the way back to the beginning. These were the trios on April 18th. So if you will join your trio, I will take attendance. We're going to take like a 4-minute break. Group 1 up here, group 9 back there. Right. Boom. Boom. Come on. What the hell is this? There we go. All right. Alrighty, so the objective of this class all along has been that if you learn a beginner's understanding plus a few details of Christianity, you get a lot of connected understanding of how Westerners communicate. Every time I have taught this class, the short version at Gaidai, over at Suda, and even here, when I first present Christianity for Beginners at the first class meeting, the questions I get include a lot of questions about if God is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, why is there suffering? Why do wicked people get what they want? Why is there pain? Why are there natural disasters? That kind of thing. And at Gaidai, we took a day and we talked about it, and it was far and away the most energetic conversation we had. So the topic I am taking up today, we talked about at Suda last week, and they turned in some of the most provocative questions I've had yet, which I love. So, I say all of that to say, we are going to talk about social support. Social support is the study in interpersonal communication. When something painful happens to you, when your girl or boyfriend dumps you, when you lose your job, when you are injured and your athletic season or career ends, or when you find out you have a terminal illness, or someone in your family dies, things like that. How do you turn to other people and communicate with them to try to cope? Now, we are going to talk about differences in how Japanese people and Westerners practice social support. In the second half of the class, the biblical influence will not be the influence on how they are different. We're going to get to cognitive reframing, and I'm going to talk about the cognitive reframing strategy that is typical of Christians. I'm doing that because this question of why would an all-powerful and loving God allow suffering It comes up every time we have the conversation about the belief system. So, first thing to say about social support. A 2012 study by a team of researchers at the University of California, Santa Barbara divided social support behaviors into two categories: problem-based or emotional. Someone has something terrible happen. Their house burns down. Everything they own is gone. They've got small children whose toys were burned up in the fire, and the children are heartbroken that they lost their favorite stuffed animal. The emotional support would be they're scared, they're crying, their life has been ripped apart. You do things to try to help them cope with the emotions. Problem-based might be build them a new house. Go get them another stuffed animal. It's about going to what it is that's creating the trauma and dealing with that. And the study found that the divide was very sharp. What was typical among Japanese people as a social support strategy was an emphasis on problem-based supports. One quick example, finding it on my notes. Oh, there. Okoden. Consolation money given at a funeral. When people from the United States learn about that custom, it seems bizarre. You give money at a funeral? It just seems weird. Because funerals in the United States are about crying together. Some of the research into, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but some of the research into the difference in funerals. It's a tradition, maybe not universally practiced today, but it still has some force, that at Japanese funerals, you ought to avoid making the guests uncomfortable by showing emotion, and you can actually raise the status of your family if you seem not only calm, but cheerful and outgoing, and you welcome the guests to the funeral. Americans, again, would find that completely out of place. They would say, don't put on a fake happy face for us. We know you're sad. Cry with us. We will cry with you until you feel better. Because the difference in social support has to do with addressing the emotions directly. Now, I did get ahead of myself. An anthropologist at the University of Edinburgh in a 2016 study reported the goal of problem-based social support in Japan is inclusion. What is common in Japan when you know that someone close to you has had a death in the family is to go and do things for them and take care of them and be very problem-based to show them that they still belong, that you still include them, that you have not distanced yourself from them, that you are still doing life together. In the United States and across much of the West, emotion-based social supports, they're careful to try to respect the independence of the person who is grieving. So, if you are feeling very sad, if you are crying uncontrollably, someone may ask, do you want me to sit with you? Do you need a hug? Do you want to go for a walk? Or do you want me to leave you alone? And that commonly will be offered as an option because it's always important to respect the person who is grieving. They get to decide what is best for them. It is a commonly shared belief in the West. Everybody grieves differently. So we will show respect for the one who grieves. We will help them manage their emotions, but we will be quick and willing to leave them alone if that is what they ask. That brings us then to Brant Burleson. Brant Burleson retired a few years ago. He was a communication professor at Purdue University, far and away the leading researcher of social support and comforting. And I'm very glad that today I got the question where I got to recommend thinking fast and slow and talk about System 1 and System 2, because he said comforting is another System 1, System 2 process. It depends on, as people deal with their grief and deal with their emotions, and his research very definitely had a weird problem. It was aimed at Westerners. He said, sometimes they will process your comforting through System 1. They are so overcome by emotion that they barely hear the words you say, which means the words themselves don't matter much. And he said, in that situation, what is comforting are environmental cues. That's when you give them a hug. That's when you use a gentle tone of voice. That's when maybe you invite them to lie down on the couch, you cover them with a blanket, you bring them comfort food, you do as many things as you can to make physical sensations that are soothing. Those are environmental cues. But Burleson said sometimes people have uncontrollable emotions, but they are looking to manage them through System 2. And in that situation, what it looks like is they'll say over and over again, I just want to know why. I just want to make sense of it. I can't figure out why this happened. I keep going back to why. And it's not problem-based. They're not trying to figure out how to manage the situation itself. They just think their emotions would be controllable if there were a reason. And in that situation, Burleson's research, his data show the most effective form of comfort or social support is cognitive appraisal. Cognitive appraisal. That's a big couple of words, but all it means is, can you talk to them about what happened to where they see it or understand it differently? Possibly, you someday might have 2 or 3 children. Let's imagine your youngest child gets their first serious girlfriend or boyfriend when they're a teenager, and it lasts a while, and then that girlfriend or boyfriend dumps them, and the relationship ends. And they are in intense pain, and they want to know why, and they ask questions like, am I so ugly? Am I so unlikable that nobody's ever going to want to be my girlfriend or boyfriend again? And you might say, well, your 2 older siblings both had their first romantic relationship. It ended. They went on to have more. They learned from the first one. You have a lot of time in your life. Very often, first relationships are not the ones that last. And they'll think about that, and their emotions become manageable. Now, that's just an example. But it is a kind of social support helping them think about the source of their pain differently. Widely practiced for people who are grieving, who are processing it through System 2. And according to Burleson's research, if they are processing it through System 2, the most effective way to comfort them. That brings us then, let me look at the time, that brings us to the question commonly asked after the first class meeting of this class. Why does an all-powerful, perfectly loving God allow suffering? And when something intensely painful happens, a death in the family, let's keep that as the running example, a death. How do Christians comfort one another in a way aimed at cognitive appraisal, changing the cognitive appraisal to make the emotions manageable? What I am about to talk you through, I would never use this to try to comfort someone who wasn't a Christian. It would be cruel. I would never use it to comfort someone who had just become a Christian and was new to it. But I have used these ideas, talked with Christian friends of mine when terrible things happen, to help them cope with their emotions. It's not complicated. There are only 3 ideas. There will be some passages from our audio Bible. First thing, God suffered too. God knows what suffering feels like. God sympathizes. God is near to people who are in pain, physical pain, or emotional pain. How do we know? Because God suffered too. You've heard me say before that Jesus was falsely accused, he was arrested, and then he was put to death. You've heard me say that all of God's wrath for all disobedience, every human being, past, present, future, all went on Jesus. I've said that. But what I have not made clear, this was more horrible than we at first imagined. Let me jump over to the audio Bible, which is right there. The night that Jesus was arrested and taken away, they came and they found him in a garden. He had gone to the garden with his apostles. And while he was in the garden, he prayed. And I am going to play you the passage of what he prayed. This starts in, and I have not sound checked, so let me very quick turn the sound up. Yeah, that would have been way too low. I think 50 tends to be right. Okay, we're in the right chapter, and boom. Nope. Works a lot better when I press play. So he prayed about his horror over what was about to happen, and he asked God to allow him not to do it. Now, in the end, he said, "What you will, not what I will," but he asked not to do it. Now let me jump over, and I have a slightly longer passage about the actual crucifixion. It has an important detail in it, and then I'll explain.
字架から降りてきて自分を救ってみろ。同じように祭司長たちも立法学者たちと一緒になって代わる代わるイエスをあざけていった。他人は救ったが自分は救えない。キリスト、イスラエルの王に今十字架から降りてもらおう。それを見たら信じよう。一緒に十字架につけられていた者たちもイエスを罵った。さて、12時になった時、闇が全地を覆い、午後3時まで続いた。そして3時、イエスは大声で叫ばれた。エロヒ、エロヒ、レマサバクタニ。訳す。我が神、我が神、どうして私をお見捨てになったのですか。という意味である。そばに立っていた人たちの何人かがこれを聞いていった。
ほら、闇を呼んでいる。
すると、一人が駆け寄り、海面に水ぶどう酒を含ませて、足の甲につけ、待て、エリアが下ろしに来るか見てみろ。と言って、イエスに飲ませようとした。しかし、イエスは大声を上げて、息を引き取られた。すると、神殿の幕が上から下まで真っ二つに裂け、イエスの正面に立っていた百人隊長が、イエスがこのように息を引き取られたのを見て言った。この方は、本当に神の子であった。女たちも遠くから見ていたが、その中には、マグダラのマリアと、小ヤコブとヨセの母マリアとサロメがいた。
So, Jesus cried out while on the cross, my God, why have you abandoned me? What was easy to understand for people watching, and I've actually over here in the presentation skipped a couple of slides with artists' representations. Jesus in the garden, praying, begging to be spared this. What was easy for artists to depict was how painful crucifixion itself was, with nails through his hands and feet and being suffocated as he got too exhausted to pull himself up. But that wasn't the suffering. That wasn't the pain. Thousands of people, hundreds of thousands have been crucified. A lot of Christian martyrs were crucified, or they were put to death even more gruesomely than this, singing and praising God. Jesus, on the other hand, was having a crying, screaming breakdown over it. Why? We talked at the beginning, when we talked about the Trinity and perichoresis and the dance, we said the Father, the Son, and the Spirit have no separation. They love one another perfectly, and there is no separation. Now, what did Jesus cry out on the cross? My God, why have you abandoned me? What the data tell us in social science, the most stressful, painful thing you can have is the loss of love. We said previously, the top of the stress inventory is divorce. And the most loving married couple in history didn't love one another the way the Father and the Son loved one another. God cut Jesus off completely, because that is what our disobedience earns us from God, to be cut off. We said in this class before, we can't see or hear God, because the few times in the Bible that someone does see or hear God, they're terrified, because they think God is about to destroy them and they deserve it. Jesus' entire life, he could see and hear God effortlessly, talk to him all the time, until he was on the cross and God abandoned him. That was the suffering. Not only did Jesus suffer, the Father also suffered. think for just a moment about having a child and having to watch that child go through the worst possible pain, and you can see them writhing in pain and you cannot stop it. That is what happened to the father. That's the first part. By itself, it's not very comforting, but keep listening. The second part doesn't sound much better. There's not an explanation. If I had taken more room on the slide, this should say there's no explanation that we can understand. There's a story in the Bible from the first half, the part that Jewish people also find sacred, of a man named Job. Now, the story of Job is complicated. I'm not going to get into all of it today, but Job suffered terribly, and he kept crying out, if only God would explain, why is this happening to me? And God finally did speak to Job, and God said to Job, I created the universe. My reasons are beyond what you can understand. There are reasons, but you cannot understand them. Your only option is to trust me. For years, I have explained this at the churches I've belonged to. I explain it to children, young children, this way. Babies have to get their shots. The shots keep them healthy. The shots are very important. But the baby doesn't understand that. They only know that it hurts. And you can talk to that baby all day about measles and polio and chickenpox and being left blind or paralyzed because you didn't have that shot. That baby is not going to understand it. That baby is a baby. They only know that it hurts. Now think for a moment about the gap between a baby and mom in understanding, and then any human being and the creator of the universe. There are reasons they are not available for us to understand. Now, the one thing babies do, they're smart. When she gets that shot, she's not going to run away from mom. She turns and she snuggles into mom to get comfort. So when I talk to my fellow Christians about why they're suffering, there's not an explanation. God does have a reason, not one we necessarily can understand. But we can snuggle into him for comfort, like a baby with mom. Third and final part of the explanation. For Christians, it is a Christian teaching that we have a hopeful future. Now, this refers to what the Bible teaches Christians happens after they die, after we die, and also at the end of time, when God closes the books on history and judges his creation. That future for Christians is very, very hopeful. I have two passages to play you very, very briefly. And then a little bit of explanation, and it will be time for your trios. This is Jesus speaking.
私の父の家には住むところがたくさんあります。そうでなかったら、あなた方のために場所を用意しに行くと言ったでしょうか。私が行って、あなた方に場所を用意したら、また来て、あなた方を私のもとに迎えます。私がいるところに、あなた方もいるようにするためです。
In my Father's house are many mansions. If it weren't so, I would have told you. I am going to make a place for you, and I will come back and bring you to myself, so where I am, you may also be. And then there's one other passage in the last book of the Bible, the one that is a vision of what will happen in the future at the end of time. I believe I've played this one previous time. I'm about to again. In the movie Titanic, when the boat was going down, there was a Christian preacher on the boat deck, and he recited this from memory. It's often read out loud at funerals because it is a passage meant to give people hope.
第21章。また私は新しい天と新しい地を見た。以前の天と以前の地は過ぎ去り、もはや海もない。私はまた聖なる都、新しいエルサレムが夫のために飾られた花嫁のように整えられて、神の身元から天から下ってくるのを見た。私はまた大きな声が御座から出て、こういうのを聞いた。見よ、神の幕屋が人々と共にある。神は人々と共に住み、人々は神の民となる。神ご自身が彼らの神として共におられる。神は彼らの目から涙をことごとく拭い取ってくださる。もはや死はなく、悲しみも叫び声も苦しみもない。以前のものが過ぎ去ったからである。
What both of these passages lead up to is the teaching that what Christians expect at the end of life and at the end of time is to be reunited with perfect love with no more separation. And artists will sometimes say, oh, you'll be reunited with everybody you knew in the world, and you'll live in a beautiful city with streets of gold. But that's not the essence of what this is talking about. God, who created all of us, who loves perfectly, we are separated from God by our disobedience, but what Jesus endured meant that we can be reunited with God. It's a process that begins and we mature, but then when we die or history ends, it's complete. And we are back in God's presence, God who loves us perfectly with no separation. What are the implications for social support? They are these. First of all, at death, we get better. There is a poet, Christian poet, who said death used to be an executioner, but the gospel just made death a gardener. The idea being, it turns us from what we are now into something more beautiful. It doesn't mean, and I am not saying, Christians are unafraid of death. Doesn't mean that. I imagine there have been a lot of times in your life where you had to do something new and it was exciting, but at the same time scary. Starting a new school. I've attended a lot of weddings and I've performed one wedding, and the people getting married are excited, but they're nervous. Me coming here to Japan. Me coming to this campus to teach all of you. It was exciting. You were a little scary. So, it's possible to feel both at once. In a lot of situations that call for social support, this provides the basic material for cognitive reappraisal. If there's been an end to a relationship, you were dating or even married, and it ends, well, first of all, God is still at work in your life. There may be relationships in your future. Even if not, you have the love of the one who loves perfectly. End of your career. Maybe you were working very hard to have a dream job that you thought would turn into a career. But for a Christian, you've got exactly one job, and that's to be available and obedient to God to glorify Him wherever He puts you. He's going to provide what you need. You're going to have some kind of food, clothing, and shelter. You may discover along the way things you thought you needed, you really don't need, and maybe even needed to give up. If it's the end of your life, the social support, the cognitive appraisal might be, your father's house has many mansions. You are going home. That's the way to think of it differently. And if it's the end of your loved one's life, your spouse, your best friend, even your child, God will be with you in your pain. He also watched his son die. Those are the comfort messages we give each other. And if you get to the point where you get it, there are things you will get about Westerners that if you don't get it, Westerners just seem bizarre. And that was the point of this. All right, we are going to our trios a wee small bit early, but come up with some good questions for me, and I will field them next week. And let me get it up. Not that. That's for debate class. There.